It was a quiet, cloudy morning, and the air felt heavy with sorrow. Inside the modest church, rows of people sat in silence, their heads bowed. A soft hum of whispered prayers and muffled sobs filled the room. At the front, a polished wooden coffin lay surrounded by white lilies. It was the funeral of 16-year-old Liam, a boy full of promise, taken too soon. Liam's mother, Olivia, sat in the front row, her face pale and strained. Her hands gripped the edge of the pew as though holding on for dear life. The loss of her only child was unbearable. She had raised Liam alone after his father left when he was just a baby. They were inseparable, a small but loving family. And now, with Liam gone, Olivia felt a void that nothing could fill. Yet amidst her overwhelming grief, there was something else. A faint, nagging feeling she couldn't shake. Something about Liam's death didn't add up. The doctors had said it was sudden heart failure, but Olivia knew her son. He was healthy, full of energy, and had never shown any signs of illness. The explanations felt rushed, too neat and far too convenient. Her thoughts were interrupted as the priest finished his eulogy. People began rising to pay their final respects. Olivia stood and approached the coffin, her legs trembling beneath her. She stared at it for a moment, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe that Liam was at peace, but her instincts told her otherwise. Something about this moment felt wrong, deeply wrong. She reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the lid. Suddenly she felt a surge of urgency, an unexplainable need to see Liam one last time. Turning toward the funeral director, Olivia's voice wavered, but her determination was clear. "I need to open it," she said softly. The room fell silent. Whispers spread among the attendees like wildfire. Her sister Rachel rushed to her side, whispering, "Olivia, no. Don't do this to yourself. Let him rest." But Olivia shook her head. "I have to," she said firmly. "I need to know." The funeral director hesitated, his face pale. "Mrs. Harper, I don't think—" "Open it!" she interrupted, her voice louder this time. The murmurs in the room grew louder, but Olivia was unmoved. She was his mother, and she needed the truth. The director reluctantly approached the coffin. The sound of the lid being unlatched echoed through the silent room. Olivia held her breath, bracing herself for what she was about to see. What happened next left everyone in the room speechless. As the funeral director carefully lifted the lid, the room seemed to hold its breath. Olivia leaned forward, her heart racing, her mind swirling with both fear and determination. When the lid was fully open, she gasped loudly, stumbling back in shock. Her trembling hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. Inside the coffin lay a boy's body, but it wasn't Liam. The hair color was wrong, the features were different, and the clothes— Liam didn't own a suit like the one this boy was wearing. Olivia's knees threatened to buckle as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't her son. This was someone else entirely. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps and whispers filled the air as people exchanged panicked glances. Rachel grabbed Olivia's arm, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean it's not Liam? Of course it's him. It has to be." "No," Olivia said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't my son. I know my son. This isn't Liam." The funeral director's face turned pale, his eyes darting nervously between Olivia and the coffin. "Mrs. Harper," he stammered, "there must be some mistake. The body was delivered to us directly from the hospital. It's supposed to be your son." Olivia's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. "Then explain this," she demanded, her voice rising. "If this isn't Liam, where is he?" The crowd buzzed with confusion and fear. Then an older man in the back of the room stood, his face pale and his voice shaky. "I recognize that boy," he said, pointing toward the coffin. "I saw him on the news. He went missing a month ago." The room froze. Every whisper, every breath seemed to stop as his words hung in the air. Olivia's mind raced. A missing boy? What was he doing in her son's coffin? Her stomach churned as dread began to seep into her thoughts. If this wasn't Liam, then where was her son? And why had someone gone to such lengths to hide the truth? Tears streamed down Olivia's face, but her fear was quickly replaced by a fierce resolve. She turned to the funeral director, her voice shaking with rage. I want answers now." The director hesitated, his lips trembling. "I'll call the hospital," he muttered, fumbling for his phone. But Olivia didn't trust him. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands shook. Something was being hidden, something dark and unthinkable. And Olivia wasn't leaving without the truth. The funeral director dialed the hospital, his hands trembling as he spoke into the phone. The room was tense, filled with uneasy whispers and stifled sobs. Olivia stood firm, her eyes locked on the coffin, her mind racing. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for an explanation. After a few agonizing moments, the director hung up, his face pale and his lips pressed into a thin line. "The hospital. They have no record of this body being sent to us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room erupted again, voices overlapping in confusion and disbelief. "No record?" Olivia repeated, her voice sharp and cracking with emotion. "How can there be no record? Someone needs to explain what's going on. Where is my son?" The director stammered, "Mrs. Harper, I don't know. This has never happened before. I assure you, we will launch an investigation." "An investigation won't bring my son back," Olivia snapped. Her voice carried a weight that silenced the room. She looked down at the coffin, then back at the director, her face a mixture of grief and fury. "I'm not leaving here without answers." Just then, her sister Rachel stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Olivia, what if this is some sort of mistake? Maybe the hospital mixed things up." Olivia shook her head. "This is more than a mistake," she said, holding up a corner of a document she had grabbed earlier from the funeral director's briefcase. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing a transfer record. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the timestamp. "This says the body was transferred 2 hours before Liam's supposed time of death. How is that possible?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rachel's eyes widened as she read the document. "That doesn't make sense," she whispered. He wasn't even gone yet." Olivia's breath hitched as the realization sunk in. "He wasn't dead when they moved him," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of dread and hope. "Someone took him. Someone wanted us to think he was gone." The room fell into a heavy silence as her words echoed. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to believe. Olivia turned to the funeral director, her eyes burning with determination. "Who did this?" she demanded. "Who took my son?" The director looked like he might faint. "I don't know," he stammered. "I'll find out, I promise." But Olivia didn't trust him. Her instincts told her that the truth wouldn't be found through official channels. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover this up, and she would have to uncover the truth on her own. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "If no one here will tell me the truth," she said, her voice steady and fierce, "then I'll find it myself." And with that she stormed out of the chapel, leaving behind a crowd frozen in shock and confusion. The only thing on her mind was one haunting question. Where was Liam? And why had someone gone to such extremes to hide him? Olivia stormed into the hospital later that afternoon, the transfer record clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was a mask of determination, masking the turmoil inside. She demanded to speak with the administrator, her voice unwavering despite the chaos in her mind. She wasn't leaving until she got answers. After an infuriating wait, the hospital administrator finally arrived, a tall man in a crisp suit with a guarded expression. "Mrs. Harper," he began, "I understand this is a difficult time, but—" "No!" Olivia interrupted, her voice sharp. "You don't understand. My son's body was never delivered to the funeral home. Instead, someone else's body was in his place. How do you explain that?" The administrator's expression faltered, but only for a moment. "That's highly unusual," he said carefully, "but mistakes can happen during the transfer process." "Mistakes?" Olivia shot back, holding up the transfer record. "Explain how this mistake includes a timestamp showing my son was moved before he was even pronounced dead." The administrator's face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Mrs. Harper, I assure you, we'll conduct a thorough investigation." "I don't want an investigation," Olivia said, her voice rising. "I want the truth. Someone knows what happened, and I'm not leaving until I find out." As if on cue, a young nurse standing nearby hesitated before stepping forward. "Mrs. Harper," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't be saying this, but something hasn't felt right." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone urgent. The nurse glanced around nervously, lowering her voice. "There's been talk. Rumors about patients being transferred under strange circumstances. Some of them weren't even terminal. And the ones involved in these transfers, they disappear." The administrator's expression hardened. "That's enough," he said sharply, glaring at the nurse. "You're not authorized to discuss internal matters." But Olivia's attention was fixed on the nurse. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "If you know something, tell me. I need to find my son." The nurse hesitated, her eyes darting between Olivia and the administrator. Finally, she whispered, "There's an old facility. Abandoned. People say it's where these patients are taken. It's on Maple Street near the edge of town." Before Olivia could respond, the administrator stepped forward, his voice cold. "Mrs. Harper, I think it's time you left. We'll be in touch with any updates." Olivia didn't argue. She turned and left the hospital, the nurse's words echoing in her mind. An abandoned facility on Maple Street? It was a lead, a faint, fragile lead, but it was something. As she drove toward the facility, her heart pounded. The possibility of finding Liam alive filled her with both hope and dread. What had they done to him? Why had they taken him? The answers she sought felt closer than ever, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would be darker than she ever imagined. The abandoned facility on Maple Street loomed in front of Olivia like a dark secret waiting to be uncovered. The building was old and decaying, its cracked windows and rusting metal doors speaking of years of neglect. Overgrown weeds and vines crawled up its walls, and the air around it felt heavy, almost suffocating. Olivia parked her car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady her nerves. This is it, she thought. Whatever answers lay within these walls would change everything. Gathering her courage, she stepped out of the car and approached the entrance. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. She pushed open the door, which groaned loudly on its hinges, and stepped inside. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the musty scent of decay. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked concrete floor as she ventured deeper into the building. The faint flicker of a fluorescent light down a long corridor drew her attention. Olivia's heart raced as she walked toward it, every instinct in her body screaming to turn back. But she couldn't. Not now. The corridor was lined with old rooms, their doors ajar, revealing broken furniture and abandoned medical equipment. It was clear this place had once been a hospital or research facility, but it had been long forgotten, or so it seemed. As she reached the end of the corridor, the light grew brighter, spilling out from a room on the left. She paused, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The room was eerily clean compared to the rest of the facility. A single table sat in the center, and on it was a file folder marked with a symbol she didn't recognize. Next to it was a photo, and Olivia's breath caught in her throat when she saw Liam's face staring back at her. He looked pale, his expression distant, as though he were lost in a world she couldn't reach. Before she could process what she was seeing, a voice startled her. "You shouldn't be here." Olivia spun around to see a woman standing in the shadows. She was tall, her face partially hidden by a scarf, but her piercing eyes shone with a mix of sadness and guilt. "Who are you?" Olivia demanded, her voice trembling. "Where is my son?" The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "My name doesn't matter," she said softly. "What matters is that your son is alive." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as a wave of relief washed over her. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did they take him?" The woman hesitated, her expression heavy with regret. "They took him because he was chosen. This facility, it was used for experiments, medical trials that pushed the boundaries of what was ethical. Your son, he was part of those trials." Olivia's mind reeled. "Experiments?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What kind of experiments?" The woman glanced at the photo of Liam on the table. They were trying to create something, someone beyond human capabilities, but the process changed him. He's not the same boy you knew. He's different. Olivia felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. Different how? She demanded. What did they do to him? The woman's gaze dropped to the floor. They were trying to create a cure for incurable diseases, to push the limits of human endurance. But the methods they used, they came at a cost. Liam survived, but he's not ready to come home. Not yet. Olivia's hands trembled as she clutched the table for support. Where is he? She asked again, her voice filled with desperation. I need to see him. The woman shook her head. You can't, not yet, but I promise when the time is right, he will come to you. Before Olivia could respond, the woman stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. Olivia was left alone in the room, her heart pounding and her mind racing with more questions than answers. She looked down at the photo of Liam, her fingers brushing over his face. I'll find you, she whispered. No matter what it takes, I'll bring you home. With renewed determination, Olivia left the facility, clutching the file and the photo tightly. The truth was devastating, but it gave her something she hadn't had before. Hope. She would wait, she would fight, and she would do whatever it took to reunite with her son. The days after Olivia's discovery were filled with restless determination. She pored over the files she had taken from the abandoned facility, searching for any clue that could lead her to Liam. The documents were dense, filled with medical jargon and references to experiments she couldn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. Her son's disappearance wasn't random. It was part of something far bigger and darker than she had imagined. Among the files, Olivia found one name that stood out: Dr. Marcus Reed. His signature appeared on multiple reports, and his role seemed central to the experiments. After some digging, she discovered that he was a lead researcher who had gone underground when the facility shut down. Finding him became her next goal. Olivia spent days making calls, following leads, and tracking down anyone who might know where Dr. Reed was. Her persistence finally paid off when a former employee of the facility reluctantly gave her an address. But be careful, the man warned. He's not someone you can trust. The address led Olivia to a remote house on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a thick line of trees. The house was small and unassuming, but Olivia's instincts told her this was the place. She parked her car a short distance away and approached cautiously, her heart pounding with anticipation. When she knocked on the door, it creaked open slightly, revealing a dimly lit interior. "Dr. Reed," she called, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. A man appeared in the doorway, his face gaunt and his eyes weary. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "My name is Olivia Harper," she said firmly. "I'm looking for my son, Liam. He was part of your experiments." The man's expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, starting to close the door. Olivia stepped forward, blocking the door with her hand. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice rising. "I know you were involved. I have the files. I know what you did to my son. If you have any decency left, you'll tell me where he is." Dr. Reed hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously. Finally, he sighed and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said quietly. The inside of the house was cluttered with papers and books, the walls lined with shelves filled with medical texts. Reed gestured for Olivia to sit, then poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly. "What do you want to know?" he asked, sinking into a chair across from her. "Everything," Olivia said. "Why was Liam taken? What did you do to him? And where is he now?" Reed took a deep breath, his face lined with regret. "The experiments were supposed to save lives," he began. "We were trying to push the boundaries of medicine, to find cures for diseases no one else could. But we went too far. The procedures were inhumane." Olivia's stomach churned as he continued. "Liam was one of the youngest subjects," Reed said. "He was strong, resilient. But the treatments changed him, physically and mentally. When the facility shut down, we couldn't risk exposing what we'd done. We staged his death and moved him to another location." Olivia's hands clenched into fists. "Where is he now?" she demanded. Reed hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. "He's alive, but he's not ready to come home. The treatments, they're still affecting him. He needs time to adjust." Olivia's heart ached, but she refused to back down. "Take me to him," she said. "I need to see him." Reed shook his head. "I can't. If they find out I told you anything, they'll come after both of us." "I don't care," Olivia said fiercely. "He's my son, and I won't stop until I find him." Reed looked at her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "There's a safe house," he said. "He's there. I'll give you the address, but you have to be careful. They're watching." Olivia's hands trembled as she took the piece of paper he handed her. The location was just outside the city. She stood, her resolve unshaken. "Thank you," she said, turning toward the door. Reed watched her leave, a mix of guilt and admiration in his eyes. As Olivia drove away, her heart pounded with both fear and hope. She was closer than ever to finding Liam, but she knew the final step would be the hardest. Whatever waited for her at the safe house, she was ready. Nothing would stop her from bringing her son home. The safe house was located on the outskirts of the city, hidden among dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. Olivia parked her car at the end of the dirt road, her heart pounding as she stared at the small, secluded cabin. Its windows were dark, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. She clutched the piece of paper with the address, her hands trembling. This was it. This was where they had taken Liam. She stepped out of the car and approached the cabin, each step heavier than the last. Her mind raced with thoughts of what she might find inside. Was Liam okay? Would he recognize her? What had they done to him? Reaching the door, Olivia hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed it open. The door creaked, revealing a dimly lit interior. The cabin was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture and a faint smell of antiseptic in the air. "Liam!" Olivia called softly, her voice trembling. She stepped further inside, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. At first, there was no response. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Olivia's breath caught as she saw him. Her son. He stood at the far end of the room, his posture tense, his face pale but unmistakably Liam. Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she took a step toward him. "Liam," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's me, it's Mom." Liam's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition. But something was different. His gaze was distant, guarded, as though he were struggling to process her presence. "Mom?" he said softly, his voice hoarse and uncertain. Olivia's heart shattered at the sound of his voice. "Yes, it's me," she said, rushing toward him. She reached out to embrace him, but he took a step back, his movements hesitant. "They told me you wouldn't come," Liam said, his words slow and deliberate. "They said I couldn't go back." Olivia's tears flowed freely as she shook her head. "You don't have to listen to them anymore," she said. "I'm here now, and I'm taking you home." Liam's expression softened, but there was still a shadow of doubt in his eyes. I'm not the same," he murmured. "They did things to me, Mom. I don't know if I can go back." Olivia reached out again, this time placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "You're my son," she said firmly. "No matter what they did, no matter how you feel, you're still Liam, and I'll do whatever it takes to help you." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then slowly, Liam nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "Okay." Olivia pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as tears of relief and grief mingled. She had found him. After everything, she had found her son. But as they stood there, a noise outside the cabin broke the moment. The sound of tires crunching on gravel sent a wave of fear through Olivia. She turned to the window and saw headlights approaching in the distance. "They're coming," Liam whispered, his voice filled with panic. "We have to go now." Olivia grabbed his hand, her resolve unshaken. "Then we'll go," she said. "But I'm not losing you again." Together they bolted out the back door, disappearing into the woods as the headlights drew closer. Olivia didn't know what dangers lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. She would protect Liam at all costs. The fight wasn't over, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in months she felt hope, a fragile flickering light guiding her through the darkness. Olivia and Liam ran through the dense woods, the sound of their pursuers' vehicles growing louder behind them. The ground was uneven, the air cold and biting, But Olivia didn't let go of Liam's hand. Her only thought was to get him to safety. Branches scratched at her arms and face, but she pushed on, adrenaline overpowering the pain. "Over here," Liam whispered, pointing toward a cluster of large trees that formed a natural cover. They crouched behind the trunks, trying to catch their breath as the sound of voices echoed through the woods. "They couldn't have gotten far," a man shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams flickering just beyond where Olivia and Liam hid. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to Liam, whispering, "Do you know who they are?" "They're from the facility," Liam said, his voice trembling. "They won't stop until they take me back." Olivia felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. "They won't take you," she said firmly. "Not while I'm here." She scanned their surroundings, trying to formulate a plan. The pursuers were closing in, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the trees. Then Olivia spotted a narrow path leading downhill toward what looked like an old stream bed. It was risky, but it was their best shot. "Follow me," she whispered, gripping Liam's hand tightly. They moved quietly, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. The path was steep and slippery, but they managed to stay ahead of the search party. As they reached the stream bed, Olivia noticed a small, weathered shed partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked abandoned, but it could offer them temporary shelter. "In there," Olivia said, leading Liam toward the shed. They slipped inside, closing the rickety door behind them. The air was damp and musty, but it was quiet, and for now they were hidden. Liam slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged. Olivia knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. He nodded weakly. "I think so. But, Mom, they won't stop. They'll find us." Olivia cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "We've made it this far and we'll keep going. I won't let them take you, Liam. I promise." Tears welled in his eyes, and he nodded again. "Okay," he whispered. Outside, the sound of footsteps and voices grew fainter. The search party was moving away, but Olivia knew it was only a matter of time before they came back. She needed to come up with a plan, one that would keep Liam safe for good. As she held him close, her mind raced. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed help, someone who could expose the truth about the facility and hold those responsible accountable. Then it hit her. Dr. Reed. He had given her the address to the safe house, but he might know more. He might have the resources to help them disappear, or even to fight back. It was a long shot, but it was the only option they had. "We'll rest here for a little while," Olivia said, stroking Liam's hair. "And then we'll go find someone who can help." Liam looked at her, his eyes filled with trust and a glimmer of hope. "Okay, Mom," he said quietly. As the night stretched on, Olivia stayed awake, listening for any sign of danger. The fight for her son's safety was far from over, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never stop fighting. Together, they would face whatever came next, no matter the cost.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.